So picture this. It's the dawn of the 20th century, and a new kind of giant is walking the earth. Not giants of flesh and bone, but of steel, oil, and capital. These were the trusts, and their rise set the stage for one of the biggest showdowns in American history, the incredible, unchecked power of corporations versus the will of the people. This is the story of how America decided to try and tame its first corporate giants. Let's dive in.
This quote from the reformer Herbert Croly, it just perfectly captures the anxiety people were feeling. The core belief, the fear, was that this insane concentration of wealth wasn't just an economic issue. No, it was a crisis for democracy itself. It felt like the very opportunities that define the American dream, the chance to start your own business, to compete, to make it on your own, were being snatched up and locked away by a powerful few.
And wow, this image says it all, doesn't it? This is one of the most famous cartoons of the era, showing John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil as this terrifying octopus. And just look at its tentacles. They're wrapping around everything, steel, copper, shipping, and, yep, one is even slithering its way around the U.S. Capitol building. It's such a powerful symbol for how people saw these things, as monsters with an unstoppable, suffocating reach. Which brings us right to the big questions we're going to tackle in this explainer. How on earth did these corporate behemoths get so powerful in the first place? And maybe more importantly, once they were here, what was the country going to do about it? Okay, first things first. Before we go any further, we need to get our terms straight. What exactly was a trust? So, what are we talking about here? You can think of a trust as, well, a kind of super monopoly. It was a clever legal setup where a bunch of different corporations in the same industry would hand over control of their stock to a single board of trustees. The end result? One single entity could now call all the shots for an entire market, letting them set prices and basically eliminate any and all competition. And you have to remember, this was something totally new. Sure, there had always been big businesses, but nothing on this kind of national, all-consuming scale. For your average American, this level of concentrated power felt deeply, deeply wrong. And honestly, kind of scary. So how did we get here? What were the conditions that allowed these titans, or robber barons as their critics called them, to forge these massive monopolies? It was really like the perfect storm of factors all coming together at once. You had a government with a very laissez-faire or hands-off policy. You combine that with incredible new ways to produce goods, a huge national market now connected by railroads, and what seemed like an endless supply of natural resources and new immigrant labor. And bam, you've got the perfect recipe for explosive growth. Now, what's really fascinating is how these guys built their empires. There were basically two different playbooks. On one hand, you had Andrew Carnegie, who mastered what's called vertical integration. He wanted to own every single step of the process, from the mines where the iron ore was dug up, to the steel mills, all the way to the railroads that shipped his final product. Then you had John D. Rockefeller, who perfected horizontal integration. His strategy was simpler: just buy out all your competitors. He'd buy up all the other oil refineries until his company, Standard Oil, was the only one left. The speed at which this all happened it's breathtaking. Just look at this little 7-year window from 1897 to 1904. At the beginning of that period, you had over 4,000 separate independent companies competing in the American marketplace. And by the end, those thousands of companies had been bought up, merged, and consolidated into just 257 giant firms. It was one of the biggest merger waves in history. And if you want a statistic to really put their power into perspective, get this. By 1904, these trusts controlled 40% of all manufacturing assets in the country. Their total financial value was 7 times larger than the entire national debt of the United States. They weren't just big businesses. They were literally bigger and wealthier than the U.S. government. So when you're faced with that kind of incredible power, what do? You push back. And that's exactly what the American people started to do. This was the beginning of the fight to rein in the monopolies. Now, it didn't happen overnight. The pushback actually started small, at the state level. You had farmers in the 1870s passing what were called Granger laws to try and regulate crazy railroad prices. But pretty soon everyone realized these trusts were national giants. State laws weren't going to cut it. You needed the federal government. And that led to early attempts like the Interstate Commerce Act and, most importantly, the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. The Sherman Act was a huge symbolic step, but it had a fatal flaw. The language was just too vague. It banned monopolies that were unreasonable, but it never defined what unreasonable meant. So business-friendly courts used that loophole to do nothing. And here's the crazy, ironic part. The law ended up being used more often to break up strikes by labor unions than to break up corporate trusts. So clearly, a law with loopholes wasn't going to be enough. The fight needed a true champion, someone right at the top. And that's when 3 presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, stepped into the ring. And it was really Theodore Roosevelt who set the new tone. He wasn't against big business, not at all. But he believed passionately that when a corporation got too powerful and started to hurt the public, the government had a duty, not just a right, but a duty, to step in and regulate it. He saw the president's job as being a referee between the big corporations and the working people. Okay, now this chart is fascinating because it busts a major historical myth. Everyone knows Roosevelt as the trust buster, right? But look at the data. His successor, William Howard Taft, actually broke up more than double the number of monopolies in about half the time. So why does Roosevelt get all the credit? Well, it came down to their philosophy. Roosevelt made a distinction between good trusts that were efficient and bad trusts that abused their power. Taft, who was a lawyer by training, had a much stricter view. He basically said, if a trust is breaking the law, the courts need to break it up, period. This whole debate just exploded during the wild presidential election of 1912. The question of what to do about the trusts was the central issue. And you had 3 totally different visions on the table. You had Taft, the incumbent, saying, let's stick with the court cases. You had Roosevelt running on a third-party ticket, arguing for his new nationalism. Basically, let's regulate these big companies with a powerful government agency. And then you had the Democrat Woodrow Wilson with his new freedom, which was all about breaking up the big guys to give small businesses a chance to compete again. Wilson wins that election. And his administration immediately gets to work on creating new laws that would finally, hopefully, close those old loopholes and put some real teeth into the fight against monopolies. And this all led to the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. This law was designed to fix everything that was wrong with the old Sherman Act. It got really specific, outlawing things like predatory price fixing. And remember that whole irony about the old law being used against workers? The Clayton Act explicitly protected labor unions, calling them out as not illegal monopolies. And to make sure somebody was actually enforcing all these new rules, Congress created a new watchdog, the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC. And let's be really clear about why this all happened. This new era of regulation, it wasn't just a gift from some benevolent politicians. It was the direct result of decades of pressure from the ground up, from farmers, from factory workers, and from fearless journalists and writers who worked tirelessly to show the rest of the country just how dangerous this unchecked corporate power had become. You know, the battle they fought against the trusts over 100 years ago, it really set the precedent for a debate that we are still having today, aren't we? It leaves us with these huge questions we're still grappling with. In our own age of new corporate giants, who really holds the economic power? And what is our role? What is our responsibility in making sure that power serves the public good?